You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. If I ask you to visualize a typical gamer, what sort of image comes to your mind? Is it an image of yourself, who is very likely a gamer if you're listening to this podcast? Or do you still think of the way that gamers are typically portrayed in modern media? Do you imagine that it's probably a male, perhaps unattractive, maybe overweight, very pale, living in a dark basement, perhaps their mother's basement? There's this image that exists of what a gamer is, and a large part of that has to do with media portrayal, but there's also roots to that go back even further. The idea that gamers are socially inept or even dangerous. I'm Robert Welker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system, and this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to create memorable campaigns using psychology. On today's episode, we're going to be diving into this idea of the gamer stereotype and how to move beyond that, because the research does clearly show that what so many of us perceive as a gamer is not an accurate depiction of what gamers actually are. So let's get on to the interview.
My name is John Eric Welker. I'm the vice president and co-founder of the 501c3 nonprofit charity RPG Research, Washington State Department of Health registered recreational therapist with a background in nursing, working with special needs populations. I am the founder of the Spokane Area Gaming Alliance, which is just gets everybody in the local Spokane area, try to get them in to play games with each other. Plus, I use it to recruit volunteers for conventions, stores, and libraries and things like that. I am a 21-year veteran of the United States Army. I was an LPN as my last job with them. I've been role-playing since 1979 when my Cuban grandmother gave me the 1979 starter box with the Keep on the Borderlands module in it. I have been a Wizard of the Coast delegate, which means I demonstrated all of their games from Magic to Dungeons and Dragons to Neopets, and their board games went from store to store, demoing these games and acting as a customer service agent who didn't wait for a phone call. Also, I have been running role-playing games at conventions. I was also a Dungeons and Dragons Adventures League local area coordinator for the eastern side of Washington, North Idaho. And my biggest convention I've worked was Worldcon. Worldcon is the one where they give out the Hugo Award. They called it SaskCon when it was in Spokane in 2015. I said, hey, I want to run Dungeons and Dragons at Worldcon, and I can get a lot of people in there to just run D&D. And they're like, great. We have 30 days before the show opens. Can you just run the entire department? So being stupid, I said yes. And I successfully, in 30 days, set up and ran the Worldcon gaming room from nothing. The last thing is I'm also a employee as a recreation therapist for the for-profit RPG Therapeutics LLC. So I am a professional dungeon master.
That is the dream right there. So before we get into any questions, just welcome to the show, John. I'm super excited to have you on. And I'll just tell you, like, when I first got into starting this podcast, one of the things for new podcasters was to make a list of 10 people who would be perfect people to have interviewed on your show as your dream interviews. And you were on that list for me because of all the work you've done. So I want to say a profound thank you for everything you've done for our country with your service, as well as in the gaming and mental health communities. So much of what you do is right at the heart of this show and what I try to provide for my listeners. So I just want to thank you for the energy and the countless hours that you've poured over your life into everything that you've accomplished for this community.
Thank you. I'm surprised to be on anybody's top 10 list.
I mean, you were right there at the top, because D&D and psychology and the research behind what makes role-playing games so great is really what I've wanted to feature on the show. And I think this new season, we're getting further into the psychology portion of it. The first season kind of focused more on the gaming of it. As we've grown, as we've expanded, I'm getting to talk to people who are on that list, and it's been really, really cool. And it keeps me excited about moving forward. So can you tell the Cyclothids a little bit about RPG research and what it is that company does? Because I think it is a very important thing that is done for the community.
Well, in short, RPG Research is a 501c3 nonprofit. Nobody gets paid, from Hawk Robinson, our founder and president of RPG Research, all the way down to anybody who's volunteering. There is no financial incentive to be doing this. In fact, it costs us money to do this out of Hawk's pockets, my pockets, and whatever we can get from the volunteers or donors to bring in. We research the effects of all role-playing games in all formats, whether that's tabletop, live action, electronic, or hybrids. Hybrids being like card games that use role-playing elements. Pathfinder has a great card game version of their game, but it is a hybrid. It's not a true role-playing game.
Right.
We look at those effects and we see how we can apply those to educational, therapeutic, entertainment, and professional development purposes. We can use role-playing games to teach languages, empathy, to help people with social skills. Those are the therapeutic elements that we do. Educational would be anything from teaching science, math, history, anything that you can teach in a classroom, we can pretty much teach in a role-playing game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something I've definitely talked a lot about on the show. Before we jump into this main topic, is there anything from all this research that you've done or that you've accumulated? Because I know you've brought in research from all sorts of different areas and sort of compiled it in a place, which is awesome. You have an amazing database of all these different studies that have been done, and you've poured in research of your own through the company. Is there anything that really is super interesting to you, the results that surprised you, or just anything that when you found the research or did the research kind of was just awe-inspiring?
Well, we do have the world's largest free and open research knowledge-based study. In 2004, there were about 50 to 70 studies, period. And now we have over 10,000 content items available in our database.
Wow.
Some of the interesting things that we have discovered is, for example, the main topic today is the myths. Social workers' perceptions of role-playing games is actually fairly negative. One of the things that we discovered, which we thought was awe-inspiring, is what we had to do a LARP and a tabletop role-playing sessions for the muscular dystrophy summer camp. And we have 4 levels of impairment, 0 being no impairment, and 4 being that you can't do anything without an aid. We're in a full wheelchair. We have a trach. Everything's done by electronic controls and the use of an aid. Everybody there was at least a 1 with several 4s there. And we did a live action role-playing game with them with combat. Boffer swords, lances, shields, and we had a lot of safety concerns. MDA kept saying, no, wear them out. Let them play. They don't get to get physical. And so we did everything we could to make sure everything was safe. And we had exactly 0 injuries or medical issues during the time we were there.
Wow.
Everything is in rec therapy is trial by choice. And we had one station where we were playing the exact same story, but using Adventures in Middle-earth rules, which is Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition ported over to the One Ring role-playing game.
Right. Okay.
But so we did a tabletop role-playing game and we did the physical thing. So if people didn't want to do the physical, they could come over and just do the non-physical. What we found out was that people were doing the physical stuff and needing a mental or physical break. They would come over and do the tabletop version to recharge and then go back out to do the physical again.
That's awesome. That had to be really, like you said, inspiring just to see the engagement from this community. I've heard so many stories about people who have come to role playing and do these LARP. It's beautiful to see the way that the community comes together, not just to support them, but also the way that this game sort of gives people the freedom to have encounters and interactions and experiences that they don't have in regular life. And it must be very, very rewarding to be part of that.
It is. The entire idea of role-playing games is that you get to go beyond your boundaries of what your real life is. And this is, other than a virtual reality, full immersion suit a la Ready Player One, this is as close as you can get to gaining superpowers. And for some people, walking is a superpower.
Oh, yeah. Well said. So our main topic today is debunking the stereotypes about gamers, which is something I'm sure most of the cyclothids out there have had to deal with at least once in their life, either in conversation or through the media. And frankly, it's something I think it's been exacerbated by media portrayal of gamers, because I think the stereotype of a gamer makes a very interesting character in media, but it does do some harm as well, because it does perpetuate these stereotypes. So, John, can you identify some of what the biggest stereotypes are and give us an idea of which ones may or may not be accurate, and the ones that are not accurate? How is that supported by the body of research that exists?
Well, some of these myths are back from the 80s and still have not been, they've been officially debunked, but they haven't been erased from people's consciousness, memories. You'll see things like Big Bang Theory, and they made the comment, "Oh, we've never played with a girl," and Paley's Coco character says, "Don't worry, honey, nobody has."
Yeah.
And, the myth that they're not social, which is really bizarre considering the entire game only exists in a social setting.
Right.
That we have higher levels of meaninglessness. There was a Japanese study with autistic things, and kids who played role-playing games showed a significant lesser degree of meaninglessness. That there's a higher rate of suicide for people who use role-playing games. No, actually, there's a lot lower degree of suicide among people who play role-playing games. Now, my personal theory as to why, and this is, I don't have evidence to back this up, but it seems logical to me that you're in a social group, which means you have resources and people to back up on. You're playing a game that emphasizes on problem solving. It's giving you the tools to look at a problem and come up with solutions, as well as to give you cohorts and people to communicate with that you might not have if you're not in a social setting. That's just my theory of why you would have a lower degree of suicide.
And I think my show's a pretty good example of, I try to talk to a lot of these concepts, but so much of what I talk about on the show is just theory. I'm putting my ideas about why certain things might make sense based on research that does exist, and why I think those things might be true. But really, the getting to the body of the research is I think the hardest part about finding an actual correlation is the very difficult part. I think those of us who do game and are around a gaming table can sort of see it in that hindsight bias type thing. When the research does finally come out, we get to sit there and say, well, yeah, we know that that's true because we sit there every week. We look forward to spending time with our friends, to being part of this team organization, group problem solving. Obviously, to us, that makes a lot of sense because we live it weekly or multiple times a week or whatever. And we have those sort of wonderful feelings that are associated with the gaming table and being part of a community. How much current research is being put into it? Like this year, is it a pretty big researched area?
Well, I can't state to everybody's research because people don't report to me. They will submit things to be put into the forums, but those are people who are finished their document, the papers. So I don't know who's working on what now, but I do know that some of the questions that are trying to be answered, people who are using Dungeons and Dragons in their college courses for philosophy, psychology, rec therapy, all these different fields, and even business are running things off of role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. And there are plenty more role-playing games than Dungeons and Dragons, of course. But like one of the things that we want to answer is how many people, we see that all these positive aspects of Dungeons and Dragons, mental health-wise, education-wise, and all these things. And one of the questions is, how much of that is a direct benefit of role-playing games, and how much of it is attracting the people that are already prone to those traits? For example, psychopathy, people who have a high violence trait, high aggression trait, that's, I think, the better term, are people who run role-playing games have a lower than average aggression trait, or do they have a lower aggression trait because they play role-playing games?
Right. Yeah, I know that is something I actually recently was looking at in a research paper for my master's course is looking at violence in games, because a lot of the early research showed that immediately after playing violent video games or engaging in games that had violent behavior included in them, people would score immediately afterwards high in a more aggressive responses. But in the long term, they weren't really looking at that and whether or not that could be a cathartic release for those people who were engaging those sort of things, so that they would actually be long-term less violent than other individuals. I think that's fascinating research.
Just a quick example of that. Hawk Robinson was working in a jail, and the jail had recent lockdown because of violence that occurred elsewhere in the jail. He was able to, in the cell that he was allowed to work in, he was able to get members of opposing gangs to spend their time working on this role-playing game, being cooperative with each other, and not engaging in the violence and the other problems that were happening around the rest of the prison by having them focus on this game. And it worked very well. Eagle Peak was a school that we worked at. And this is the last chance school. You get kicked out of school, you go to an alternate school. You get kicked out of the alternate school, you went to Eagle Peak. And the kids self-regulated that were in the program because they had the intrinsic motivation that they knew that if they weren't self-regulated during the day, they didn't get a play at the end of the day in the role-playing game.
Yeah.
Even demonstrating those behaviors during the game, like, I need to take a break, self-advocating for themselves.
That's wonderful.
It was a big deal for us.
Why is it that you think that some of these stereotypes are still around? The research is clearly showing that a lot of them aren't true, but they continue to persist, especially in media and pop culture. Is it just because there hasn't been enough time since like the Satanic Panic and the worry about those kind of things? Or is it, like I was saying, maybe it is the character of the 40-year-old virgin gamer who lives in their mom's basement is just more interesting to portray in the media than somebody who is thriving and successful and articulate with their words and in a group?
Well, look at Big Bang Theory. What we have is a bunch of very highly educated people who play role-playing games. They have very few of their friends are average intelligence, but it is a comedy. So what's funny? Dysfunction, or everybody who has a normal, regular life, playing Dungeons & Dragons like on the E.T. the movie, it's just a game. And there's nothing really to poke fun at. They're just playing a game. It would be no different than Monopoly. Well, nobody's going to laugh at that. So we got to poke at those stereotypes, because that's funny, even if it is demeaning or gives wrong impressions for things. One of the reasons that these things, in our opinion, are still persistent is because of what Hawk refers to as the gamer floater theory. If you're not a gamer, the vast majority of your exposure to gamers would be what you would see in the public.
Yeah.
The vast majority of gamers, of role-playing gamers, play at home. They don't play in public venues. So you don't see 90 or even 98%. Then the people that you do see are people who you'll get 10 people in a game room playing at a time, and one person has a behavioral issue. They fit the stereotype. They're overweight. They have maybe some odious habits. They may have had a meltdown because of something that's going there. My son has had public meltdowns because he's autistic. So when you come there, you see those 10 people playing it. You don't play role-playing games. You came in to buy Monopoly or whatever you came into that store to buy. Who are you going to remember?
Yeah, it's going to be the one that fits the image that you already have in your head about a gamer. Yeah, that your confirmation bias confirms this is what gamers look like when you see that.
And not only that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're told by people, only nerds and weirdos and psychopaths play role-playing games. Well, I'm not any of those. I can't play.
Right.
Oh, it's really bad for girls to be at role-playing game sessions. Well, geez, I got to avoid that. So guess who doesn't show up? And in the public settings, the Gamer Floater series is that small percentage of people are people who play these pickup games, pugs, can't stay in a game normally. Their behavior gets them eventually kicked out. So they go to a pickup game because they're open to everybody. Well, or, the DM doesn't know who they are. And so they get moved from store to store and store to store. So you see one guy in 5 different stores acting out. Well, he now represents everybody.
That's a fascinating theory. I think personally, it seems spot on to me. It does make a lot of sense, especially when you think of, if I'm outside of the gaming group and I don't know anything about role playing and I look at what I can find that is available, it is all very stereotypical in media portrayal. And you're right. I would feel like that is what a gamer looks like walking into a game store and seeing somebody acting out or just being overly abrasive and loud. That's exactly where my mind would go. So I think that's a spot on theory. Is there any stereotypes that are out there that you think are more damaging to gamers than others? And if there is one in particular or a couple in particular, how would we combat that stereotype?
Well, probably the most dangerous one is that we're dangerous. Because we have literally had people in modern times. We were working at a library in northern Washington, and a parent dragged their kid away saying, no, people who play those games kill people. This was only a few years ago, before the COVID and everything, but still, it wasn't that long ago. And they would have a discussion with us of explaining why, no, that's not true. Where, the murders that happened related around role-playing games in the 80s were falsely identified as being related to role-playing games.
Right.
We had a person who was a secretary at our office space that we used before we got the RPG Research Center. And she was really mad at Dungeons & Dragons because it caused her nephew to commit a double homicide. Hawk took 15 minutes a day for several weeks talking to her before she realized that they weren't related and that if anything, the role-playing game probably held off the homicides longer than it would have occurred if he hadn't been a player.
Right. Well, I know I've heard you and Hawk talk about violence in particular and crimes and how the actual statistics show that those who are engaged in role-playing games are significantly lower than the general population.
The statistics do show, again, is this a case of the role-playing game creating people that are less likely to commit criminal and violent behavior? Or is it people who are less likely to create criminal behavior are drawn to the role-playing game? Yeah, there just happen to be I personally believe that there's a lot of correlation between active role-playing games and improved behaviors, improved empathy. We've used it successfully to teach people empathy. We use it to teach communication skills. We use it to teach organizational skills. I mean, everything from having to plan a trip to literally riding a bus. We've done a program where you did a tabletop version and riding a bus was part of the tabletop role-playing game. And then we did a LARP version where you literally had to get out and ride the bus and do things. It's very cool. What can we do to combat it? Well, first of all, we need to change the narrative about 180 degrees.
Yes.
Claims are negative, but research proves that RPGs are positive. We need to provide more examples like the secretary who thought Dungeons & Dragons caused murders and having her turned around. We need people to advocate what benefits role-playing games has provided for them. I have seen innumerable number of people who say that role-playing games saved their lives. Literally.
Yes, absolutely.
There was even a one about LARP where there was a show, it's called LARP Saved My Life. We need to, when people come up and say these things in public, such as the 700 Club, I don't know if they're still doing it since Pat Robinson died, but Pat Robinson, up until he died, almost yearly would have a episode of anti-role-playing games. We need to refute those people. We need to pay attention to what reports are coming out there. Boom Headshot, which was violence in role-playing games, which has been thoroughly debunked. The student author lost her PhD. The instructor who was writing with this thing did not lose his PhD, but he's finally in jail for a differently related topic. We need to actively support good research and debunk bad research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just speak to my own story. I spent a very large portion of my role-playing life, which has been about 25 years now. I spent a very large portion of that time only talking about role-playing with the other people who I was role-playing with. In other conversation, I was very guarded about my hobbies because I was worried about the way that it would be perceived by individuals who were hearing about it. Even members of my family, like they would know I'd play role-playing games, but I wouldn't really talk about it. And I definitely didn't talk about it at work because I didn't want the gamer stereotypes or any negative connotations to affect the way I was viewed in the workplace. Now I've very much shifted on that, and I think people should be proud of the fact that they're part of role-playing games, and they should be proud of the fact that, especially if they're in a successful career, the things that you can attribute being good at that you learned in role-playing games. Like, I know being able to manage groups has a lot to do with having a lifetime of being a dungeon master, and being able to handle schedules is something you learn trying to schedule games for the role-playing table. I've said over and over in the show, it's very much about practicing life and getting better at those skills that you're going to use in your day-to-day life.
One of the reasons, and you just hit on that greatly, is inward navel-gazing of the RPG design and publishing. They write 99.9% of the games with completely unnecessary barriers to entry. They make it too difficult.
Yeah.
They require mass learning. A dungeon master has to grab his book and read the whole thing and then read his module, and then he's got to run it. Or he has to have a mentor. You find somebody else who's already a dungeon master and they teach you. Frank Menser in 1980s did BECME, Basic Expert Companion Masters and Immortals D&D series, and he starts off with a solo adventure module. We don't say choose your own adventure because copyright laws.
Right.
But
Yep.
so the solo adventure module, it comes with the assumption you have no idea what a role-playing game is. You've never heard the term. Now let's dive in and learn the game, and we will introduce each rule as you're playing. And you'll run a couple of these, and then we go on to, you're going to be a dungeon master. It takes you by the hand and leads you step by step through the process of being a dungeon master. Okay, your players now have these kind of choices. They're going to go here, 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 or there. Then you go to here. Okay, these are the rules you're going to need. Everything is just laid out, simple as it can be, to make that easier. The only other company that does that well would be 7th edition Call of Cthulhu, has solo adventure books that teach you how to play Call of Cthulhu. They don't have the DM side where they handheld you. You still have to read the entire module and learn it, as opposed to it taking you saying, okay, this is the introduction. Now here's where they're going to go. Those kind of things. Also, we have to realize that for the people that are outside of the gamer thing, is that fantasy is not the number one genre. Science fiction is not the number one genre. The number one genre for the world's entertainment is police procedurals and medical dramas. So you want to get people interested from the outside, start offering some games that fit their preferred genres. You can do a police procedural with GURPS, or we've even done it with Doctor Who. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I would think the old D20 modern system would probably work well for that as well.
You can do some of these games, remove some of the magic and do the clues and things like that. We teach all of this. This is our role-playing game professional level 1 training workbook. The 2nd edition is out. You can get this one. So if you go on to Amazon and you try to buy this book, look for the black cover, not the purple cover.
That's awesome. I'll get a link to that in the show
notes.
And
there will be a 3rd edition coming out soon after that. You may want to wait for the 3rd edition before you invest into it. But this is a workbook, and to fill it out, to get the information for it, you either watch our free videos or you join us on our training, our classes that we train, which we broadcast. That's why you have free videos from previous to watch. And by joining our training, you get to ask questions and fill in information that might not be directly in the workbook. The greatest benefit, of course, is it's free. We don't, we charge you for the book, but we don't charge you for training. Unless you want to go through RPG Therapeutics and you want a tighter class or I think this is 18 weeks, I believe, right now.
And through RPG Therapeutics, you guys do certifications and things like that as well. Yeah,
certifications for our training. Also, we will do professional gaming for people. You want me to come and run a game for your program or school, I can do that for a reasonably expensive price. Or, we also do therapeutic clients. Our biggest issue is because rec therapy is it used to be easier, but changes in the law made it harder for rec therapy to bill insurance.
Interesting. Very fascinating information. Let's move on to tricks of the trade. So for today's tricks of the trade, I've asked John to give some advice to the gamers out there on how to have conversations about gaming with non-gamers. I know for my own life and my own situation, I have to navigate this on a regular basis, talking about my podcast or my book or my hobby, or when defending my research proposals to professors, because I'm in industrial organizational psychology, and I'm trying to correlate a lot of what I've done in the workplace to what I've done in role-playing and my experience there. So I also brought an idea of my own. I'll go ahead and go first, John, give you a moment to gather your thoughts. So my idea for talking to non-gamers would be find a way to relate your hobbies with the things that other people can relate with. It's very similar to what you were just saying about finding a game that suits their genre, or talking about how TTRPGs are similar to board games or video games that they might already enjoy playing. Or you're doing a collaborative story. It's similar to reading a book, but it's sort of like you said, it's a solo guided adventure book. You're choosing your adventure along the way, and you're writing a story together as a group that you're experiencing in a group setting. So it's just kind of this community-based thing, but find a way to relate it to the things that they already understand and give them a frame of reference that makes it easier for them to wrap their heads around. That would be my advice.
Our advice is very much similar to that as far as explaining what a role-playing game is. It's cooperative storytelling with rules. It's the same thing as campfire tales that people have been doing since the beginning of time, with a yes and or yes but scenario in there. where you are, each person is adding to the story and one person is the general narrator to keep the whole story together as a collaboration. I use theater as symbolism. I use let's pretend, except in saying bang, I shot you. Well, I'll say bang, I try to shoot you, roll some dice and figure out if I actually did.
Yeah.
But as far as talking to people about the games and assuaging their fears and their myths about these things, I would confront them with the things that we can learn from the games or why. You don't tell people, just say, hey, it's fun. But I also learn all this stuff, all these side things like, because of role-playing games, I also paint miniatures. I learned 3D design for computer-aided drafting. I have had people design an entire ship and even create a model of it because the game that they were playing says, I want a ship. And he went through, instead of just saying, I designed this big ship, it does these things, he went and did all the math and the science and actually drafted out you could build this ship.
That is amazing. That actually is a very good point. It actually brings me back to something that another one of my gaming group members and I did years ago, which was we taught ourselves Microsoft Excel so that we could build a kingdom building workbook that drew from multiple pages and had like drop-down menus and did all this very difficult math and made it streamlined and simple for us so that we could move quickly through our story. And that's just another whole point about in the workplace that's very beneficial to me. We use Microsoft Excel on a daily basis, but I learned it because I was playing role-playing games. And so, yes, to your point, think about all the other things that you can learn because you're having fun. You're learning skills in the guise of just playing a game.
And you're not even aware that you're learning things about culture, foods. We've had a role-playing game group that we would do themed potlucks. And
fun.
It was just another learning aspect that we threw in there, and not intentionally. We're not doing this because, we want to understand our math better. What is a role-playing game but an exercise in creative writing, basic mathematics to include things like the Pythagorean theorem, or trying to determine whether or not I have enough range to hit somebody with a bow if I'm shooting at them at this angle from this distance, solving puzzles that may use hydrodynamics in there. So you're looking at all of these things that you're learning because you have to use them to puzzle them out, that you're not even noticing that you're using math, science, and history.
Absolutely. So before we sign off, John, I want to give you the opportunity to share with the Cyclothids where they could connect with you on social media, where they can find out more about the companies, anything else you want to share.
Well, my email is john@rpgresearch.com, and we can be contacted at RPG Research almost anywhere that has a social media center. Obviously you can go to rpgresearch.com to learn about us and go see at the very bottom all of our different links to everything. But if you go to youtube.com/RPG Research, insertmedianame.com/RPG Research, you will find us there at most of these places, including things like Pinterest and other ones. Now, some of them aren't as active as others, but /RPG Research is the best way to find us and everywhere, including Discord, Twitter, Facebook, etc.
And we'll make sure we have those links posted in the show notes, Cyclothids, so that you can get a hold of them on their social media. And we'll put your email in there as well, John, so that they can contact you directly. Anything else before we sign off?
Not really. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them and getting their ideas and things like that. I do need to point out that RPG Research, being a full nonprofit, does have the community center. You will see more about that on the webpage. And we desperately need donations. It's going to cost us a minimum of $4,000 a month just to keep the doors open. And right now we're good till about April, but after that we may have to close to the public temporarily while we bring up additional funds from other things. I will be doing a fundraiser on Twitch for Call of Cthulhu, the Masks of Nyarlathotep. It's going to be full cosplay, props, and very realistic handouts. Like if you're supposed to be looking at a newspaper clipping, it will look like it was clipped out of a newspaper with articles on the back and the sides of everything.
Awesome.
It's going to be beautiful. But we need donations to keep these things working and running. So go to rpgresearch.com/donate and please help.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cyclothids do take the time to do that. This is a very important piece of our community. And I think we all know, either through hindsight bias or just sitting around the table, we all know how important these games have been to our lives. And we want the research to continue to show the rest of the world what it is that we all know already. So definitely take the time to do that. And John, thank you so much for being here today. A real, true pleasure.
Thank you. And as I always say, have a wonderful day and dream well.
And with that, let's move on to our knowledge check.
For today's knowledge check, I want to focus on an article that comes from NYM Gaming, and it was written by Ashley Berry in 2015, called Gamer Stereotypes, the Man-Child and the Unicorn Treatment. And this article is very interesting because it takes a look at a lot of the media portrayals that have focused on these two different tropes of stereotypes that exist, one for males and one for females. The males, of course, being the man-child or the adult who is acting very childish because they are a gamer, or the unicorn, the sole attractive young lady who is a gamer, who exists sort of as the embodiment of sexuality within the gaming community. And it does a very in-depth dive to the show The Big Bang Theory, which we've talked about several times on this episode today, and gives very specific examples from some episodes that really point out these two tropes. One episode example that they give that embodies both of these tropes comes from an episode called The Bakersfield Expedition, during which the group has some misadventures as they're traveling to one of the famous cons, like a Comic-Con or a Game Con. And in that episode, the car breaks down for the guys on the way to the convention. And while their car is broken down, a police officer asks them if they need to call their moms because they see them dressed up in this Star Trek regalia. And then right as that happens, Howard, who serves as the punchline, comes out and announces that his mother has arranged a rental car for them. And everyone in the audience laughs, of course, but this is definitely that man-child stereotype, and they're playing on that. You know, their interests and hobbies are considered to be infantile, and then the fact that, oh yes, I do actually live with my mother is the punchline. It's really just emphasizing that stereotype. Meanwhile, in the episode back at home, the ladies of the show decide that they are going to try to better understand their significant others and go to a comic book store and brush up on their comics for when their significant others return. They will have this new awakened knowledge of something that their significant others are interested in. And so there's this interesting scene where these three ladies are in the comic book store, and they are just the focus of the male gaze is the best way that it can be described. All the men openly staring at them like they've never seen a woman in the gaming store before, and only the owner of the comic book store is able to really engage with them in any sort of a casual sense. But it really does give the whole scene this idea that these females who are standing in the midst of this male space are like unicorns. It's something that they've never seen out in the wild before because it's so mythological. Obviously, both of these stereotypes can be harmful in their own ways. I would encourage you to go on and read this article because it does point out some very interesting tropes that exist between male and female gamers. I hope today's episode has helped raise a little bit of awareness for you in some of the problems that can exist out there with gaming stereotypes, and the importance of understanding the truth and the research. And if you do find this as important as I do, I hope that you will connect with RPG research or RPG therapeutics and contribute in whatever way you can, being volunteering or contributing research or contributing cash to keep places like this open. I donate to them myself, and I just really want to advocate the importance of this research in debunking the myths surrounding gamers and the stereotypes that exist therein. And as always, if you would like to connect with me any further, you can find me on Instagram. You can send me an email to dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. That is it for today, Cyclothids. As always, until next time, I will see you next session.